Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows comes the best of indie podcasts. One of England's oldest and darkest mysteries, the true identity of the world's most popular serial killer, Jack the Ripper, may have finally been solved after 137 years. English historian and author Russell Edwards tells the New York Post, DNA found on a shawl recovered from one of the victims was used to reveal that a butcher by the name of Aaron Kosminski, who had died at a mental institution in 1919, was responsible for the killings. Has the Jack the Ripper mystery been solved? My name is DJ, and this is the Mythical True Crime Podcast. Hello, and welcome to tonight's show. Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer who was active in and around the impoverished Whitechapel district of London in 1888. In both criminal case files and contemporary journalistic accounts, the killer was also called the Whitechapel Murderer and the Leather Apron. Attacks ascribed that Jack the Ripper typically involved women working as prostitutes who lived in the slums of the East End of London. Their throats were cut prior to abdominal mutilations. The removal of internal organs from at least 3 of the victims led to speculation that the killer had some anatomical or surgical knowledge. Rumors that the murderers were connected has intensified from September through October 1888. And numerous letters were received by media outlets and Scotland Yard from people purporting to be the murderer. The name Jack the Ripper originated from the Dear Boss letter written by someone claiming to be the murderer, where it spread like wildfire through the press. The letter is widely to be believed to have been a hoax and may have been written by journalists at the time to heighten interest in the story and increase their newspaper circulation. Another, the From Hell letter, was received by George Lusk at the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee and came with half a preserved human kidney, reportedly taken from one of the victims. The public came to believe that the existence of a single serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, mainly because of both the extraordinarily brutal nature of the murders and the media coverage of his crimes. Extensive newspaper coverage bestowed widespread and enduring international notoriety to the Ripper, and the legend solidified. A police investigation into a series of 11 brutal murders committed in Whitechapel and surrounding areas between 1888 and 1891 was unable to connect all the killings conclusively to that of the murders of 1888. 5 canonical victims, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, and their murders between August 31st and November 9th of 1888 are often considered most likely to be linked. The murders were never solved, and the legends surrounding the crimes became a combination of historical research, folklore, and pseudo-history, capturing public imagination to this present day. Now, back in the mid-19th century, England experienced an influx of Irish immigrants who swelled the populations of major cities, including that of East End of London. In 1882, Jewish refugees fleeing areas of Russian Empire and other areas of Eastern Europe emigrated to that same area. The parish of Whitechapel in the East End became increasingly overcrowded, with the population increasing to that of approximately 80,000 inhabitants by the year 1888. Work and housing conditions worsened, and a significant economic underclass developed. 55% of the children born in the East End died before they were ever 5 years old. Robbery, violence, and alcohol dependency were commonplace, and the endemic poverty drove many women to prostitution to survive on a daily basis. In October 1888, London's Metropolitan Police Service estimated that there were 62 brothels and 1,200 women working as prostitutes in the Whitechapel area alone, with approximately 8,500 people residing in the 233 common lodging houses within Whitechapel every night, with the nightly price for a bed being 4 pence, equivalent to £2 today, and the cost of sleeping upon a lean-to or a hangover rope stretched across the dormitory being 2 pence per person. The economic problems in Whitechapel were also accompanied by a steady rise in social tensions. Between 1886 and 1889, frequent demonstrations led to police intervention and public unrest, such as Bloody Sunday in 1887. Anti-Semitism, crime, racism, social disturbances, and other severe deprivations influenced public perceptions that Whitechapel was a notorious den of immorality. Such perceptions were strengthened in 1888 when a series of vicious and grotesque murders attributed to Jack the Ripper received unprecedented coverage in the media. The large number of attacks against women in the East End during this time adds to uncertainty to how many victims were actually murdered by the same person. 11 separate murders, stretching from April 3, 1888 to February 13, 1891, were included in a Metropolitan Police investigation and were known collectively to the police docket as the Whitechapel murders. Opinions vary to whether or not these murders should be linked to the same culprit, but 5 of the 11 Whitechapel murders, known as the Canonical Five, are widely believed to be that of the work of the Ripper. Most experts point to the deep slash wounds in the throat, following by extensive abdominal and genital area mutilations, with removal of internal organs and progressive facial mutilations as a distinctive feature of that of the Ripper's mode of operating. The first 2 cases in the Whitechapel murders file, whose Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tambrom, are not included in the Canonical Five. Smith was robbed and sexually assaulted on Osborne Street in Whitechapel at approximately 1:30 a.m. on April 3rd in 1888. She had been bludgeoned about the face and received a cut just below her ear. The blunt object in question was also inserted into her vagina, rupturing her peritoneum. She developed peritonitis and died the following day in the London hospital. Smith stated that she had been attacked by 2 or 3 men, one of whom she described as a teenager at the time. This attack was linked to later murders by the press, but most authors attribute this murder to general East End gang violence unrelated to the Ripper case. Tambrom was murdered at a staircase landing in George Yard, Whitechapel, on August 7th in 1888. She had suffered 39 stab wounds to her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, and abdomen, and additional knife wounds inflicted to her breasts and vagina. All but one of Tambrom's wounds had been inflicted with a bladed instrument, such as a penknife, and with one possible exception, all the wounds had been inflicted by a right-handed person. Evidence also concluded that she had not been raped at the time. The savagery of Tambrom's murder and the lack of obvious motives had led the closeness of the location and date to the later canonical Ripper murders led police to link this murder to those later committed by him. However, this murder differs from the later canonical murders because, although Tambrom did repeatedly get stabbed, she had not suffered any slash wounds to her throat or her abdomen. However, many experts still do not connect Tambrom's murder with the later murders that occurred, with the differences in the wound patterns. It's important to understand that all the victims, whether the Canonical Five or not, should be known. Their names should be spoken, if that equal to the known killer of Jack the Ripper. The body of Mary Ann Nichols was discovered at about 3:40 a.m. on Friday, August 31st, in Bucks Row, which is now Dunward Street in Whitechapel. Nichols had been seen last alive approximately 1 hour before her body was discovered by Mrs. Emily Holland, with whom she had previously shared a bed at a common lodging house with on Thrall Street, walking in the direction of the Whitechapel Road. Her throat was severed by 2 deep cuts, one which was completely severed all the tissue all the way down to her vertebrae. Her vagina had been stabbed twice, and the lower part of her abdomen was partially ripped open by a deep, jagged wound, causing her bowels to protrude out. Several other incisions inflicted on both sides of her abdomen were caused by the same knife, and each of these wounds had been inflicted in a downward thrusting manner. 1 week later, on Saturday, September 8th, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered at approximately 6 a.m. near the steps of a doorway to a backyard on 29 Hanbury Street. As in the case of Nichols, her throat had been severely cut with 2 deep cuts. Her abdomen had been cut open entirely, and the section of flesh from her stomach being placed upon her left shoulder, and another section of skin and flesh, plus her small intestines, being completely removed and placed above her right shoulder. Chapman's autopsy had revealed that her uterus and sections of her bladder and vagina had also been removed. At the inquest of the Chapman's murders, Elizabeth Long described having seen Chapman standing outside 29 Hanbury Street at about 5:30 in the morning, with the company of a dark-haired man wearing a brown deerstalker cap and a dark overcoat, and that of a shabby, genteel appearance. According to eyewitnesses, the man had asked Chapman, quote, "Will you?" To which Chapman had replied, "Yes." Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were both killed in the early morning hours Sunday, September 30th in 1888. Stride's body was discovered approximately 1 a.m. in Dutfeld's yard, off of Berner Street, which is Hendricks Street now in Whitechapel. Cause of death was a single clear-cut incision measuring around 6 inches across her neck, which had severed her left carotid artery and her trachea before terminating beneath her right jaw. The absence of further mutilations to her body led to uncertainty whether or not Stride's murder was committed by the Ripper, or whether he was interrupted during the attack. Several witnesses later informed police they had seen Stride in the company of a man in or close to Berner Street on the evening in question, September 29th, and in the early hours of September 30th. But each gave differing descriptions. Some said that her companion was fair, others dark-skinned. Some said that he was shabby dressed, others said well-dressed. Eddowes' body was found on the corner of Mitre Square in the city of London, 3/4 of an hour after the discovery of the body of Elizabeth Stride. Her throat was severed from ear to ear, and her abdomen ripped open by a long, deep, jagged wound before her intestines had been placed over her right shoulder, and the section of intestines being completely detached and placed between her body and left arm. Kidney and a major part of Eddowes' uterus had been removed, and her face had been disfigured, with her nose, cheek being slashed, and cuts measuring 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch, respectively, vertically incised through both of her eyelids. A triangular incision, the apex of which pointed towards Eddowes' eye, had also been carved upon each of her cheeks, and the section of the lobe of her right ear was later recovered from her clothing. A police surgeon who conducted the post-mortem upon Eddowes' body stated that his opinion with these mutilations would have at least taken 5 minutes or more to complete. A local cigarette salesman named Joseph Lawden passed the narrow walkway on Mitre Square named Church Passage with 2 friends shortly before the murder. He later described seeing a fair-haired man with a medium build and with a shabby appearance with a woman who may have been Eddowes. Lawden's companions were unable to confirm his description. However, the murders of Stride and Eddowes ultimately became known as the double event. A section of Eddowes' bloody apron was found in the entrance of the Goulston Street, Whitechapel area at 2:55 a.m. A chalk inscription upon the wall directly above this piece of apron read, quote, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This graffiti became known as the Goulston Street Graffito. The message appeared to imply that a Jew or Jews in general were responsible for the series of murders, but it's unclear whether or not the graffiti was written by the murderer himself on dropping the section of apron, or was merely incidental and nothing to do with the case. Such graffiti was commonplace in Whitechapel, as Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren feared that the graffiti might spark anti-Semitic riots and ordered the writing washed away before dawn. The extensively mutilated and disemboweled body of that of the final victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was discovered lying in a bed in a single room where she lived at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street, at 10:45 a.m. on Friday, November 9th, 1888. Her face had been, quote, hacked beyond all recognition, with her throat severed down to the spine, her abdomen almost emptied of its organs. Her uterus, kidneys, and one breast had been placed beneath her head, and other viscera of her body placed beside her feet. About the bed and sections of her abdomen and thighs upon the bedside table. Her heart also was missing from the crime scene. Multiple ashes found within the fireplace of 13 Miller's Court suggests that Kelly's murderer had burned several combustible items to illuminate the single room as he mutilated her body. A recent fire had been severe enough to melt through the solder between the kettle and its spout, which had fallen into the grate into the fireplace. Each of the canonical 5 murders was perpetrated at night, on or close to a weekend, either at the end of a month or a week. Mutilations became increasingly severe as the series of murders proceeded, except for that of Stride, whose attacker might have been interrupted. Nichols was not missing any organs. Chapman's uterus and sections of her bladder were taken, including her vagina. Eddowes had her uterus and left kidney removed, and her face completely mutilated. And Kelly's body was extensively eviscerated, with her face gashed in all directions, and the tissue from her neck being severed to the bone, although her heart was the sole body organ missing entirely from the crime scene. Historically, the belief of 5 canonical murders were committed by the same perpetrator was derived from a contemporary document which linked them together to the inclusion of others. In 1894, Sir Melvin McGotton, an assistant chief constable of the Metropolitan Police Service and head of the Criminal Investigation Department, wrote a report that stated, quote, "The Whitechapel murderer had 5 victims, and 5 victims only." Similarly, the canonical 5 were also linked together in a letter written by police surgeon Thomas Bond to a man named Robert Anderson, who was the head of the London CID at the time, on November 10th, 1888. Some researchers have assumed as fact that some of the murders were undoubtedly the work of a single killer, but an unknown larger number of killers acting independently were responsible for other victims. Authors Stuart P. Evans and Donald Rumblow argue that the canonical 5 as, quote, a Ripper myth, and that 3 cases, such as Nichols, Chapman, and Eddowes, can be definitively linked to the same perpetrator. But the less certainty exists whether or not Stride or Kelly were also murdered by the same person. Conversely, others suppose that between the 6 murders and Tarbram and Kelly were the work of a single killer. Mary Jane Kelly was generally considered to be that of the last of the Ripper's victims, and it's assumed that the crimes ended because of the culprit's death, imprisonment, institutionalization, or possible emigration. The Whitechapel murders file details another 4 murders that occurred after the canonical 5, those of victims Rose Mylett, Alice Mackenzie, the Pinchin Street torso, and Francis Coles. The strangled body of 26-year-old Rose Mylett was found in Clark's Yard High Street, Poplar, on December 20th, 1888. There was no signs of a struggle, and the police believed that she had either accidentally hung herself by the collar while in a drunken stupor or tried to commit suicide. However, faint markings left by the cord on one side of her neck suggested that Mylett had been strangled. At the inquest of Mylett's death, the jury returned to the verdict of murder. Alice Mackenzie was murdered shortly after midnight on July 17th in 1889 in Castle Alley, Whitechapel. She had suffered 2 stab wounds to her neck, and left carotid artery had been severed. Several minor bruises and cuts were also found on her body, which also bore a 7-inch long superficial wound extending from her left breast to her navel. One of the examining pathologists, Thomas Bond, believed this to be the Ripper murder, although his colleague, George Phillips, had examined the body of the previous 3 victims. He disagreed. Opinions among writers have also divided those between who suspect Mackenzie's murderer had copied the modus operandi of Jack the Ripper to deflect suspicion of himself, and those who ascribe to that this is the murder from Jack the Ripper. The Pinchin Street torso was a decomposing headless and legless torso from an unidentified woman, aged between 30 and 40, discovered beneath the railway arch in Pinchin Street, Whitechapel, on September 10, 1889. Bruising about the victim's back, hip, and arm indicated that the deceased had been extensively beaten shortly before her death. The victim's abdomen had also extensively been mutilated, although her genitals were not removed, and they had not been wounded at all. She appeared to have been killed approximately 1 day prior to the discovery of her torso. The dismembered sections of her body are also believed to have been transported to the railway arch, hidden under an old chimney. After this quick message, we'll be right back. Hello there, listeners. Whether you're new or you've been with me from the start, a great way to catch up and dive deeper into the world of mythical true crime is to check out my earlier shows. I've covered everything from Bigfoot to aliens and ghosts. Take a moment and browse through the past episodes, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means everything to me. At 2:15 a.m. on February 13, 1891, P.C. Ernest Thompson discovered a 31-year-old prostitute named Frances Coles lying beneath the railway arch in Swallows Garden, Whitechapel. Her throat had been deeply cut, but her body was not mutilated, leading some to believe that Thompson had disturbed her assailant. Coles was still alive, although she died before medical help could arrive. A 53-year-old stoker, James Thomas Sadler, had earlier been seen drinking with Coles, and the two were known to have argued approximately 3 hours before her death. Sadler was arrested by police and charged with her murder. He was briefly thought to be the Ripper, but was later discharged from court due to lack of evidence on March 3, 1891. The vast majority of the City of London police files relating to the investigation of the Whitechapel murders were unfortunately destroyed in the 1930s and 40s during the Blitz, which was the German bombing of London. The surviving Metropolitan Police files allow the detailed view of investigative procedures in the Victorian era. A large team of policemen conducted house-to-house inquiries throughout Whitechapel. Forensic analysis material was collected and examined. Suspects were identified, traced, and either examined more closely or eliminated from inquiry. Modern police work follows the same pattern. More than 2,000 people were interviewed, upwards of 300 people were investigated, and 80 people were detained. Following the murders of Stride and Eddowes, the Commissioner of the City Police, Sir James Fraser, offered a reward of £500 for the arrest of the Ripper. The investigation, initially conducted by the Metropolitan Police of Whitechapel Division, headed the Detective Inspector Edmund Reed. After the murder of Nichols, Detective Inspectors Frederick Aberlin, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews were sent to the central office in Scotland Yard to assist. The City of London Police were involved under Detective Inspector James McWilliam after the Eddowes murder, which occurred within the City of London. The overall direction of the murder inquiries was hampered by the fact that the newly appointed head of the CID, Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson, was on leave in Switzerland between September 7th and October 6th, during that time which Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes were all killed. This prompted Colonel Sir Charles Warren, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, to appoint Chief Inspector Donald Swanson to coordinate and inquire from Scotland Yard. Butchers, slaughterers, surgeons, and physicians were all suspected because of the manner of which the mutilations occurred. A surviving note from Major Henry Smith, acting commissioner of the city police, indicates that the alibis of local butchers and slaughterers were investigated, with the result of any of them being eliminated from a query. A report from Inspector Swanson to the Home Office confirms that 76 butchers and slaughterers were visited, and that the inquiry encompassed all of the employees for the past 6 months. Some contemporaneous figures, such as Queen Victoria, though the pattern of the murders indicated that the culprit was a butcher or cattle driver on one of the cattle boats that piled between London and mainland Europe. Whitechapel was close to the London docks, and usually such boats docked on Thursday and Friday and departed Saturdays and Sundays. The cattle boats were examined, but the dates of the murders did not coincide with any single boat's movements, and the transfer of the crew between boats was also ruled out. Now, there was, in September 1888, a group of volunteer citizens that had formed in London's East End. They formed a group, the Whitechapel Vigilante Committee. They patrolled the streets looking for suspicious characters, partly because of the dissatisfaction of the failure of the police to apprehend the perpetrator, but also that some of the members concerned with the murders were affecting businesses in their area. The committee petitioned the government to raise a reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer, offered their own reward of £50, which is equivalent to today £5,000 to £86,000, for information leading to the capture of the Ripper. They even hired private detectives to question witnesses independently. Now, at the end of October, Robert Anderson asked police surgeon Thomas Boyd to give his opinion to the extent of the murderer's surgical skill and knowledge. The opinion offered by Bond on the character of the Whitechapel murder is the earliest surviving offender profile. Bond's assessment is based on his own examination of the most extensively mutilated victim and the post-mortem notes from the 4 previous canonical murderers. He wrote, quote, "All 5 murderers, no doubt, were committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appear to have been cut from left to right. In the last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it's actually impossible to say in which direction the fatal cut was made. But arterial blood was found on the wall in splashes close to where the woman's head must have been lying. All circumstances surrounding the murders lead me to form the opinion that the woman must have been lying down when murdered, and in every case, the throat was the first cut." Bond was strongly opposed to the idea that the murderer possessed any kind of scientific or anatomical knowledge, or even, quote, technical knowledge of a butcher or horse slaughterer. In his opinion, the killer must have been a man of solitary habits, subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and eronic mania. Bond stated that the homicidal impulses may have been developed from a revengeful or brooding condition of the mind, or that religious mania may have been the original disease, but I don't think that either hypothesis is likely, he said. There is no evidence to the perpetrator engaging in sexual activity with any of the victims, yet psychologists have suggested that the penetration of the victims with a knife and leaving them on display in sexually degrading positions, with the wounds exposed, indicates that the perpetrator derived sexual pleasure from the attacks. This view is challenged by others who dismiss this hypothesis as insupportable supposition. While there were many, many suspects involved in the Jack the Ripper case, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, English historian and author Russell Edwards says that DNA was found on a shawl recovered from the scene of Catherine Eddowes. His quote in the New York Post reads, "When we matched the DNA from the blood on the shawl with the direct female descendant of the victim, it was the singular, most amazing moment of my life at the time. We tested the semen that was left on the shawl. When we matched that, I was dumbfounded, and we actually had discovered who Jack the Ripper was. After learning the shawl had been found at the scene of the Eddowes gruesome killing, Edwards purchased the object in 2007. Quote, "It was a voyage of discovery, with many twists and turns. The adventure was thrilling from the beginning to the end, and I was lucky to experience it." Relatives of the 5 known victims have pushed Scotland Yard to take a fresh look at the 137-year-old cold case. He said, quote, "We've got the proof. Now we need this inquest to legally name the killer. It would mean a lot to me, to my family, and to the people to finally have this crime solved." The DNA is to believe to have belonged to Aaron Kosminski, who was born September 11th, 1865, and died March 24th, 1919. He was a Polish barber, hairdresser, and, of course, was known as the suspect in the Jack the Ripper case. Kosminski was a Polish Jew who emigrated from Congress, Poland to England in the 1880s. He worked as a hairdresser in the Whitechapel area, the East End of London, where the series of murders ascribed to an unidentified person were committed in 1888. Beginning in 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his sister with a knife. He was first held in Conley Hatch Lunatic Asylum, but then was transferred to Leavesden Asylum. Police records show from the time of the murders that the name of one of the suspects was named Kosminski, the forename was not given, and described him as a Polish Jew in the insane asylum. Almost a century after the final murder, the suspect Kosminski was identified as Aaron Kosminski. Still, there was little evidence to connect him to be a suspect. However, in September of 2024, author Russell Edwards claimed in his book Naming Jack the Ripper to have proved Kosminski's guilt. In 2007, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, he had bought the shawl that he believed was left at the murder scene and gave it to a biochemist who tested it for DNA. A peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. Scientists from Innsbruck Medical University criticized the paper, however, and its conclusions substantiating that there were mistakes and misassumptions made by its authors, and the journal printed an expression of concern. An 1894 memorandum written by Sir Melville Macnaghten, the Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police, names one of the suspects, again, as Kosminski. Macnaghten's memo was discovered in a private paper from his daughter, Lady Amber Conway, by television journalist Dan Farson in 1959, and an abridged version from the archives of the Metropolitan Police was released to the public in the 1970s. Macnaghten stated that there were strong reasons for suspecting Kosminski because, quote, he had a great hatred for women, with strong homicidal tendencies. The nature of the Ripper murders and the impoverished lifestyle of the victims drew attention to the poor living conditions of the East End. The galvanized public opinion against the overcrowded, insanitary slums. In 2 decades after the murders, the worst of the slums were cleared out and demolished. But the streets and some of the buildings survive, and the legend of the Ripper still promotes various guided tours to the murder sites and other locations pertaining to the case. For many years, the 10 Bells public house in the Commons Commercial Street, which had been frequented by at least one of the canonical Ripper victims, was the focus of such tours. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, and later on, Jack the Ripper became the children's boogeyman. Depictions were often phantasmic and monstrous, and in the 1920s and 30s, he was depicted as dressed like an everyman, in clothes that everyday men would wear with a hidden secret, preying with his unsuspecting eyes to unsuspecting victims of that. Atmosphere and evil were suggested throughout lighting and other shadow play in film. By the 1960s, the Ripper had become the symbol of predatory aristocracy, and that more often than not was portrayed in a top hat, dressed as a gentleman. The establishment as a whole, quote, became the villain, and the Ripper acting as the manifestation of upper-class exploitation. The image of the Ripper merged that with borrowed symbols from other horror stories such as Dracula's Cloak, Frankenstein's organ harvesting. Fictional world of the Ripper can be fused to multiple genres ranging from Sherlock Holmes to Japanese erotic horror. Jack the Ripper features in hundreds of works of fiction, and works which straddle the boundaries between that of fact and fiction, including that of the Ripper Letters and the Hoax Diary, the Diary of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper appears in novels, short stories, poems, comic books, games, you name it, songs, plays, operas, even television programs, and many, many films. More than 100 nonfiction works deal exclusively with the Jack the Ripper murders, making this case one of the most written about in true crime genre than any other true crime genre story. The term Ripperology was even coined by Colin Wilson in the 1970s to describe the study of the case by professionals and amateurs alike. The periodicals of Ripperania, Ripperologist, and Ripper Notes were also published their research. In 2006, a BBC History magazine poll selected that Jack the Ripper was the most popular Briton and worst Briton in history. In 2015, the Jack the Ripper Museum opened in East London, and it attracted criticism for both Tower Hamlet's mayor, John Briggs, and protesters. Similar protests occurred in 2021 when the second of two Jack the Chipper fish and chip shops opened in Greenwich, which some patrons threatened to boycott the entire premises. So there you have it, an extensive deep dive look into Jack the Ripper and the possible identity of the killer himself. Thank you very much for listening. Good night. And that concludes another captivating episode, delving into the world of mythical true crime. I appreciate you joining me tonight as we listen to the facts from these true crime tales. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll uncover even more mysteries. Until then, thank you for listening to tonight's episode. Good night.